Sometimes the measure of a man isn't found in what he owns, but in what he's willing to lose for someone he's never met. In the winter of 1879, a mountain man named Silas Boone saw an elderly woman being attacked by 5 armed drifters on a lonely Wyoming trail. He could have ridden past. He could have saved himself. Instead, he stepped between them with nothing but a knife and took 9 blades meant for her. When Silas woke days later, bleeding and broken in his cabin, 4 wealthy strangers stood over his bed. They were the sons of the woman he saved, and they had traveled from back east to meet the man who did what they never could: protect their mother when she needed it most. What happens when men of fortune meet a man of true character? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you, 3 weeks before the knife fight that would change everything. Silas Boone woke to the same silence he'd known for 8 years. The kind of quiet that settles into a man's bones and teaches him the difference between loneliness and solitude. He lay in his narrow bed, watching dawn light creep through the gaps in the log walls, and listened to the mountain breathing around him. The cabin sat at 7,000 feet, tucked into a fold of the Wyoming Rockies, where the pine trees grew thick and the snow lasted well into May. Silas had built it himself, 1 log at a time, cutting and notching each piece with the deliberate care of a man who had nowhere else to be and nothing to prove. It was 12 feet by 14 feet, with a stone fireplace that drew clean, a roof that didn't leak, and a door that hung straight on its leather hinges. Everything a man needed, nothing he didn't. He rose with the sun, as he always did, and fed the fire from the woodpile he kept stacked against the inner wall. The cold was sharp this November morning, the kind that made your breath hang in the air like something solid. He dressed in layers: wool union suit, flannel shirt, canvas trousers, and the deerskin jacket he'd made 2 winters back when the old one finally gave out. His hands moved through the routine without thought, the muscle memory of someone who'd been dressing himself in the dark since he was a cavalry scout 30 years ago, the face that stared back from the small mirror above his wash basin belonged to a man who'd seen 54 winters and felt every one of them. Weathered skin the color of old leather, lines carved deep around gray eyes that had witnessed more than they cared to remember. His beard was mostly silver now, trimmed short against his jaw. The scar that ran from his left temple to his cheekbone, a Cheyenne arrow, 1855, had faded to a white line that disappeared into his beard. There were other scars hidden beneath his clothes. The body keeps a record of a man's choices, and Silas's body was a detailed ledger. He ate breakfast at the small table he'd built from pine: cornmeal mush, dried venison, and coffee so strong it could strip paint. The coffee was his one indulgence, traded for at the post down in Bear Creek every few months. He ate slowly, watching the light change on the mountains through his single window. This was his favorite hour, when the world was still deciding what kind of day it wanted to be. After breakfast, he checked his traps. The trail down to the creek was one he'd walked so many times, his feet knew every root and stone. He moved quietly, the way the Shoshone had taught him back when he was young enough to think he knew something. The forest was generous this morning: 2 rabbits and a marten. He reset the traps and cleaned the game by the creek, his knife moving with practiced efficiency. The water ran clear and cold over his hands, numbing them until they felt like they belonged to someone else. By mid-morning, the hides were stretched on frames outside his cabin, and the meat was hanging in his small smokehouse. He stood for a moment, looking out over the valley below. From up here, he could see for 30 miles on a clear day. The world spread out like a promise that had been mostly kept. No people, no noise, no demands except the ones nature made. And nature, he'd learned, was honest in its cruelty. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. He'd come to these mountains in 1871, after mustering out of the cavalry for the second and final time. The first time had been in '65, when the war ended and they didn't need as many Indian fighters. He'd tried civilian life then, worked as a deputy marshal in Kansas for 3 years. But the violence followed him, or maybe he followed it. Either way, he'd killed 4 men in those 3 years, all of them legal, all of them necessary, and all of them haunting. So he'd re-enlisted, thinking the structure would help, thinking purpose would quiet the noise in his head. It hadn't. If anything, the second stretch had been worse. More campaigns, more blood, more young men dying for reasons that made sense in Washington, but fell apart the moment you were standing in them. He'd led scouting parties, tracked hostile bands, fought in skirmishes that would never make it into the history books. He'd been good at it, too good. That was the problem. When you're good at killing, people keep asking you to do it. The final straw had been a cold morning in Montana, 1870. They'd come upon a Blackfoot camp at dawn. The orders were clear, hostile combatants armed and dangerous. But when the smoke cleared, Silas had found himself standing over a boy who couldn't have been more than 14, a hunting bow in his hands, 3 bullet holes in his chest. The boy's eyes were still open, still surprised. Silas had put his resignation papers in that afternoon. Now 8 years later, he barely thought about those days. The mountain had a way of wearing down sharp memories, smoothing them like creek water over stone. He spent his days in simple work, hunting, trapping, cutting wood, maintaining his cabin and his gear. He read the books he'd carried up here, mostly history and some poetry. He talked to his horse, a sturdy Appaloosa gelding named Chief, who'd been his only companion since '72. Sometimes weeks would pass without him speaking a word out loud. It was a good life, a quiet life. He'd made his peace with it. On this particular morning, he decided to ride down to Bear Creek. His supplies were running low: flour, salt, coffee, ammunition. The trading post sat 2 days' ride down the mountain, in a settlement barely big enough to call itself a town. 20 buildings, maybe 60 people when everyone was home. Silas went there 3 or 4 times a year, stayed long enough to trade his pelts and furs, then headed back up. The people there knew him as the mountain man who kept to himself, paid in cash or trade, and never caused trouble. That was all anyone needed to know. He saddled Chief, loaded his pack with the best of his furs, and headed down the trail as the sun reached its midpoint in the sky. The journey down was always easier than the climb back up. Chief picked his way along the narrow path with the confidence of a horse who'd made the trip many times. Silas let his mind wander, watching the aspens tremble in the breeze. Their leaves turned gold and orange in the autumn light. By nightfall, he'd made his cold camp in a grove of pines, the fire small and controlled. He ate jerky and hardtack, drank water from his canteen, and lay on his bedroll watching the stars wheel overhead. The night sky this far from civilization was something that never got old. The stars were so thick they looked like spilled salt, and the Milky Way cut across the darkness like a road to somewhere he'd never been. The next day, he reached Bear Creek by early afternoon. The trading post was run by a Swede named Olofsson, who'd prospected for gold back in '49, found just enough to open a store, and settled into a life of steady profit from the trappers and ranchers who needed supplies. Silas tied Chief to the rail and stepped inside, the familiar smell of leather, tobacco, and dried goods washing over him. "Boone," Olofsson said, looking up from his ledger. "Thought you'd be down before the snow hits." "Here now," Silas said, dropping his pack on the counter. "Got pelts." They conducted their business in few words, as both men preferred. Olofsson examined the furs with a critical eye, named his prices, and Silas accepted them without haggling. They'd been doing this long enough to trust each other's honesty. Silas took his credit in supplies: 50 pounds of flour, 20 of salt, 10 pounds of coffee, 2 boxes of 4440 ammunition, and a new whetstone. As Olofsson was wrapping the goods, the door opened and a woman stepped inside. Silas glanced up, then looked again. She was older, maybe 70, with white hair pulled back in a neat bun, and a face that spoke of dignity and determination. She wore a traveling dress of dark blue wool, well made but dusty from the road. What caught his attention, though, was the fact that she was alone. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice clear and cultured, with the accent of someone educated back east. "I'm looking for directions to Cheyenne." Olofsson blinked at her. "Cheyenne's 4 days north, ma'am." "You traveling alone?" "I am," she said simply, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Silas felt something stir in his chest, concern maybe, or recognition. He'd seen a lot of foolish things in his time, but an elderly woman traveling alone through this territory ranked near the top. The trails weren't safe, especially with winter coming on. There were still hostile bands in the high country, and worse than that, there were white men who'd rob and kill for far less than whatever this woman was carrying. "That's not wise, ma'am," Olafsson said carefully. "Not alone." "Nevertheless," she said, pulling out a small leather purse, "I need supplies for the journey. Rice, beans, dried meat, and water for my canteen. Please." Silas watched her pay. The purse was full of coins, and she handled them with the casual air of someone who had plenty more where those came from. Everything about her spoke of wealth and refinement, which made her presence here even more puzzling. As she gathered her purchases, Silas caught her eye. "You got a wagon?" "I do," she said, meeting his gaze steadily. "And a good rifle. You know how to use it?" A small smile touched her lips. "My late husband taught me 40 years ago. I've kept in practice." There was steel in her voice, and Silas recognized it. This wasn't a woman who made foolish decisions lightly. Whatever her reasons for traveling alone, they were her own, and she'd made her peace with them. He respected that, even if he didn't agree with it. "Trails get rough between here and Cheyenne," he said. "Weather can turn fast this time of year." "I appreciate the concern," she said, "but I've come a long way already, and I mean to finish my journey." She nodded to both of them and walked out, her back straight, her head high. Through the window, Silas watched her climb onto a well-built wagon, take up the reins, and drive north out of town. Something about her stuck in his mind, the combination of refinement and resolve, the way she'd looked him in the eye without flinching. "Damned foolishness," Olafsson muttered. Shaking his head, Silas nodded but said nothing. He finished loading his supplies, mounted Chief, and headed back up into the mountains. He had enough supplies to last him through winter, and his cabin was waiting. The encounter with the elderly woman nagged at him for a few miles, but he pushed it aside. People made their own choices. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, over and over again. Still, as he made camp that night, he found himself thinking about her, about the weight of wealth in her purse and the vulnerability of traveling alone, about the kind of men who watch for such opportunities in wild country. He told himself it wasn't his concern. He'd left the business of protecting people behind 8 years ago, but the feeling stayed with him all the way home, a whisper of unease he couldn't quite shake. And 2 days later, when he heard the sounds of struggle on the trail below his cabin, he would understand why. Some things, it seemed, a man couldn't outrun, not even in the high mountains, where the silence ran deep and the past was supposed to stay buried. 2 days after returning from Bear Creek, Silas was checking his snare line when he heard it, the sound that didn't belong. A woman's voice, sharp with anger and fear, carrying through the cold air like a crack in glass. He froze, one hand on the rabbit he'd been freeing from the wire. The voice came again, and this time he caught words. "I will not," firm, defiant, but edged with desperation. Then men's laughter, rough and cruel. Silas moved before he'd finished the thought, leaving the rabbit where it hung. His hand went to the hunting knife on his belt, 10 inches of carbon steel, honed to an edge that could split a hair. He'd left his rifle at the cabin, 200 yards upslope. No time to retrieve it now. He moved through the trees the way he'd learned 30 years ago, each footfall deliberate and silent. The voices grew clearer as he descended toward the main trail that ran below his property. 5 male voices now, overlapping with crude suggestions and demands. At the edge of the tree line, he stopped and assessed. 5 men surrounded a wagon on the narrow trail. The wagon was the one he'd seen in Bear Creek. Well-built, canvas cover, good team of horses. And standing beside it, back pressed against the tailgate, was the elderly woman in the blue dress. She held a Winchester rifle, but it was pointed at the ground. One of the men had a pistol trained on her team. The message clear: shoot and we kill your horses. The men were drifters, the kind that drifted from camp to camp, ranch to ranch, doing just enough work to eat and spending the rest of their time looking for easier money. Silas could read their type at a glance: worn clothes, unshaven faces, and the cocky stance of men who'd found prey they thought was helpless. The one doing most of the talking was tall and rangy, with a scar that split his left eyebrow. He held a knife loosely in his right hand, gesturing with it as he spoke. "Now, ma'am, we can do this easy or we can do this hard," Scarborough was saying. "You give us what's in that wagon, plus whatever money you're carrying, and we let you walk away." "That's fair, ain't it, boys?" The others agreed with enthusiasm. They were spreading out, flanking her, cutting off any escape. The woman's voice was steady, though Silas could see her hands trembling slightly. "I have very little of value, and I need what I have to complete my journey. I'm asking you, as Christian men, to let me pass in peace." "Christian men," one of the others repeated, laughing. "Hear that, Cade? She thinks we're Christian men, so Scarborough was Cade." Silas filed that away, his mind already running through options. 5 armed men. He had a knife. The woman had a rifle she couldn't use without losing her horses. The terrain was open here, no cover except the wagon itself. Bad odds. The kind of odds that told a smart man to walk away. Silas stepped out of the trees. "The lady asked you to let her pass," he said, his voice carrying but not shouting. "I'm thinking you should do that." 5 heads turned toward him. For a moment there was silence as they took in the sight of him. A single man, no visible weapon except the knife on his belt. Grey beard and weathered face marking him as older than any of them. Cade recovered first, his face splitting into a grin. "Well now, where'd you come from, old-timer?" "Up the mountain," Silas said. He didn't move closer, keeping his hands visible and loose at his sides. "I'm asking polite. Let the lady pass and ride on." "You asking polite," Cade repeated, still grinning. He looked at his companions. "Boys, we got ourselves a hero here. Old Mountain Man thinks he's going to save the day." The others laughed, but Silas watched their hands. 2 of them were drifting wider, trying to flank him. The one holding the gun on the horses had shifted his aim slightly, covering both Silas and the woman now. "Last chance," Silas said. "Ride on and nobody gets hurt." Cade's grin faded. "Old man, I don't know if you're brave or stupid, but either way you're about to have a bad day. There's 5 of us and 1 of you. You might want to think about that before you—" Silas moved. 3 decades of training and 8 years of mountain silence fell away, and what remained was muscle memory and the cold calculation of violence. He covered the 10 feet to Cade in 2 strides, his hand coming up in a rising arc. Cade was fast. His knife came up to block, but Silas had been fighting when this boy was still learning to walk. He shifted his angle mid-strike, caught Cade's wrist with his left hand, and drove his knife into the man's shoulder with his right. Cade screamed and stumbled back, his knife falling from nerveless fingers. The others rushed him all at once. Silas had known they would. You don't survive 30 years of frontier combat without understanding group dynamics. The second man came in high with a blade. Silas ducked under it, felt it slice through his jacket at the shoulder, and came up inside the man's guard. His knife found ribs, a quick thrust and withdrawal. The man gasped and folded. Pain exploded across Silas's back, a third attacker coming in from behind. The blade felt like a line of fire from his left shoulder blade down to his hip. He spun, his own knife coming around in a horizontal slash that opened the man's forearm to the bone. The attacker howled and dropped his weapon, but now there were 2 more, and they'd learned from watching the first exchange. They came in together low and careful, professional in a way the others hadn't been. These were men who'd killed before. The first blade took Silas in the left thigh, a deep thrust that made his leg buckle. He fell to one knee, and the second blade came in for his throat. He jerked his head back, felt it slice along his collarbone instead, shallow but bleeding. His vision was starting to narrow, the edges going dark, but his body knew what to do, even when his mind was beginning to fade. He drove his knife up into the belly of the man who'd stabbed his leg, twisted it and ripped it free. The man staggered backward, hands pressed to the wound, eyes wide with shock. The last one was the careful one, and he came in from Silas's blind side. The knife punched into Silas's right side, just below the ribs, once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. Professional work, meant to finish him quickly. Silas caught the man's wrist on the 4th thrust, his hand slippery with his own blood, and held on. The man tried to pull free, yanking backward, and that gave Silas the opening he needed. He brought his knife across in a backhand slash that caught the man across the throat. The man dropped, gurgling, and Silas swayed on his knees, trying to count wounds. His back, his shoulder, his collarbone, his thigh, his side. 3 times in his side. That was 6. No, 7. The back wound felt like it might be 2 separate cuts. Where was Cade? He turned his head, each movement feeling like it took forever, and saw the tall man climbing onto a horse, one of the drifter's mounts, tied to a tree 30 feet away. Blood was pouring down Cade's arm from the shoulder wound, but he was mobile. His face was white with shock and rage. "This ain't over, old man," Cade snarled. "My brother's gonna hear about this. Marcus Brennan. You remember that name, you hear me? Marcus Brennan." He kicked the horse into a gallop and disappeared up the trail, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. Silas tried to stand and couldn't. His leg wouldn't take his weight. He looked down and saw blood, too much blood, soaking through his pants, his shirt. Pooling on the frozen ground beneath him, he heard footsteps running toward him. And then the woman was there, her refined face shocked and pale. "Dear God," she whispered. "What have you done?" "My job," Silas said, and was surprised to find himself smiling. Old habits. His vision was darkening at the edges now, and he could feel the cold seeping in, not from the air, but from inside him, spreading out from the wounds. He'd lost too much blood. He knew the signs. He'd seen men die from less. "Stay with me," the woman was saying, her hands pressing against his side, trying to stop the bleeding. Her voice was firm, commanding, the voice of someone used to being obeyed. "Do you hear me?" "Stay with me." "My cabin," Silas managed. "Up the trail." "Quarter mile. Can you walk?" He tried again and got his good leg under him. With the woman's support, and she was stronger than she looked, he managed to stand. They stumbled together toward the wagon. "I'm Eleanor," she said, as she helped him onto the wagon bed. "Eleanor Whitlock. Silas Boone," he said. His tongue felt thick in his mouth. "Ma'am, you should take my knife." "Case more trouble comes." "I'll use the rifle," she said, climbing onto the driver's seat. "You just hold on." "Do you understand me, Mr. Boone?" "You hold on." The wagon lurched into motion, and Silas lay on his back looking up at the canvas cover swaying above him. The movement sent fresh waves of pain through his body, and he could feel warm blood still seeping from the wounds in his side. 9 wounds, he counted now. Maybe 10. His mind was starting to drift, memories bleeding into the present. He thought of the boy with the hunting bow, eyes open and surprised. He thought of all the men he'd killed over 30 years, all the violence he'd tried to leave behind. He thought of his quiet cabin and Chief waiting in the small corral and the coffee he'd never get to drink. Mostly, though, he thought about the choice he'd made, stepping out of those trees when he could have stayed hidden. Putting himself between death and a stranger, had it been worth it? Eleanor's voice drifted back to him, talking steadily as she drove, telling him about her sons, about where she'd been going, about her life. He thought she might be talking just to keep him conscious, to keep him from sliding into the dark that was reaching up for him. He wanted to tell her it was all right, that he'd made his peace with dying alone in these mountains. That saving her life was a better end than he'd had any right to expect, but the words wouldn't come, and the darkness was patient, and eventually Silas let himself fall into it, trusting that the wagon would find his cabin, trusting that Eleanor Whitlock was as strong as she seemed, trusting that if this was the end, at least it had meant something, at least for once. The violence had been for something worth defending. Silas woke to firelight and pain. The pain was a constant throbbing presence that radiated from what felt like every part of his body. The firelight flickered on log walls he recognized, his cabin, his hearth, his home. But there was something different, something that didn't belong. A woman sat beside his bed, her silver hair loose around her shoulders now. Her refined dress replaced with one of his own flannel shirts rolled up at the sleeves. She was wringing out a cloth in a basin of water, and when she saw his eyes open, she leaned forward. "Mr. Boone," she said, and her voice carried relief. "Can you hear me?" He tried to speak and managed only a croak. She brought a cup of water to his lips, supporting his head with surprising gentleness. The water was cold and sweet, and it cleared enough of the fog that he could form words. "How long?" "3 days," Eleanor Whitlock said. "You've been in and out." "Mostly out." She set the cup aside and picked up the cloth again, pressing it to his forehead. "The fever broke this morning. I think we're past the worst of it. 3 days." Silas tried to process that. He remembered the fight, remembered the wagon ride, remembered darkness. But 3 days was a gap in his life, a space where he'd been absent from himself. He looked down at his body beneath the blankets. His torso was wrapped in bandages, strips of what looked like petticoat fabric, clean white cotton stained in places with old blood. His left leg was similarly wrapped, propped on a pillow. Even the small movement of looking down sent fresh pain shooting through him. 9 wounds, Eleanor said, following his gaze. 4 of them deep enough to worry about. I cleaned them best I could with whiskey and hot water. Stitched 3 of them closed with thread from my sewing kit. She paused. I'm not a doctor, Mr. Boone, but I've birthed 4 sons and nursed them through childhood fevers and injuries. I did what I knew to do. Silas met her eyes. They were blue, he noticed, and steady. You saved my life. You saved mine first, she said simply. I'd say we're even, except we're not. Those men would have robbed me and left me alive, most likely. Her voice caught slightly. You took 9 blades meant for a stranger. That's not something that evens out with nursing. Where are they? Silas asked. The men, 2 are dead. I buried them as best I could, down the trail from where it happened. 3 more ran off after you stopped them. One of them was the one who shouted that name. Marcus Brennan, his brother, Silas said. The memory was coming back now. Cade said his brother would hear about this. Eleanor nodded slowly. I've been thinking about that. Worrying about it truthfully. But first, we had to keep you alive. Everything else could wait. Silas tried to sit up and failed. His body felt like it belonged to someone else, weak and unresponsive. Eleanor gently pressed him back down. Not yet, she said. You lost a terrible amount of blood. Your body needs time to make more. Another few days of rest at least. Can't afford days, Silas said. If Brennan's brother comes looking, then we'll deal with it when he comes, Eleanor interrupted, and there was steel in her voice again. But right now you're going to rest. Do you understand me, Mr. Boone? Despite everything, Silas found himself almost smiling. You're a hard woman to argue with. 4 sons taught me how to hold my ground, she said. She picked up the basin and stood. I'm going to make you some broth. You need to eat something more substantial than water. As she moved to the fireplace, Silas watched her work. She moved with efficiency around his small cabin, clearly having learned where everything was kept over the past 3 days. There was something both strange and comforting about having someone else in his space, breaking the silence that had been his only companion for so long. Your sons, he said after a while. You were traveling to see them? To see the eldest, Thomas, Eleanor said, stirring something in his iron pot. He manages my late husband's cattle operation in Cheyenne. I was coming from St. Louis, where I'd been visiting Daniel, my youngest. She paused. I wrote them all letters, Mr. Boone, told them what happened. Told them about you. Silas felt a stir of unease. Didn't need to do that. I needed to do exactly that, Eleanor said firmly. She brought the pot over and ladled broth into a cup, something made from the dried meat and vegetables she must have found in his stores. My sons need to know that a complete stranger nearly died defending their mother. They need to understand what that means. What does it mean? Silas asked, genuinely curious. Eleanor sat back down beside the bed, cup in hand. It means they've forgotten something important. All of them have. Thomas is so absorbed in the business that he barely writes. James, my second son, runs a bank in Denver and measures everything in profit and loss. Robert practices law in San Francisco and has become cold as contracts. And Daniel, her voice softened. Daniel paints, or he used to, before he decided art didn't make money. Now he keeps books for a shipping company and hates every minute of it. She helped Silas sit up enough to drink, supporting his shoulders. The broth was good, simple but nourishing, and he could feel warmth spreading through his chest as he swallowed. "They're good men," Eleanor continued. "I raised them to be good men, but somewhere along the way they lost sight of something essential. They built their empires and their careers, and they forgot that their mother is 70 years old and traveling alone across dangerous territory because none of them could spare the time to accompany her or come to St. Louis themselves." Silas drank more broth. "Thinking about that, you're angry with them." "I'm disappointed," Eleanor said. "There's a difference. Anger fades. Disappointment sits in your bones." She took the empty cup from him and set it aside. "But meeting you, Mr. Boone, seeing what you did without hesitation, without asking for anything in return, it clarified something for me. It showed me the distance between who my sons are and who they ought to be." "That's not fair to them," Silas said. Fighting's different from living. I was a soldier. Violence is a tool I know how to use. Your sons, they're builders, creators. That's worth something too." "It is," Eleanor agreed. "But what good is building an empire if you forget the people you're building it for? What value is success if it cost you your character?" She reached out and adjusted his blanket, the gesture maternal and automatic. "They're coming, by the way, my sons. I sent the letters 3 days ago through a rider I found in Bear Creek. By my calculations, they should arrive within the week." Silas felt his chest tighten, and not from the wounds. "Ma'am, that's not necessary. Call me Eleanor, please. And it's entirely necessary. My sons need to meet you. They need to see what real honor looks like." She stood and moved back to the fireplace. "Besides, you're in no condition to throw us all out, so you might as well accept it." Silas lay back, staring at the ceiling. The thought of company, of multiple people in his space, talking, expecting things, made him want to retreat further into the mountains. But Eleanor was right. He was in no condition to do anything but heal. Over the next 2 days, Eleanor tended him with quiet competence. She changed his bandages, brought him food and water, and talked to him about her life. She'd been born in Boston to a wealthy shipping family, had married Arthur Whitlock when she was 19, and had followed him west when he decided to build a cattle empire in Wyoming. They'd been happy, she said, in the way people who work hard together become happy. When Arthur died 15 years ago, she'd surprised everyone by taking over the business herself until Thomas was old enough to manage it. "I'm not some delicate flower," she said one evening, banking the fire for the night. "I've branded cattle, balanced books, and buried a husband. I've negotiated with railroads and fought off claim jumpers. But somewhere along the way, my son started seeing me as someone who needed protecting, rather than someone who'd protected them all their lives." Silas understood that. People see what they want to see, sometimes what they need to see. "And what do you see, Mr. Boone?" He considered the question. "A woman who's stronger than most men I've known. One who stayed with a dying stranger for 3 days when she could have ridden on." "Well," Eleanor said softly, "that's the nicest thing anyone's said to me in years." On the 3rd day of consciousness, Silas woke to find Eleanor asleep in his one chair, her head tilted back, mouth slightly open. The early morning light caught her face, and he could see the lines of age and worry, but also the bones of beauty that age couldn't erase. She'd sacrificed her own comfort to keep watch over him, and that touched something in him that had been dormant for years. He reached over carefully and pulled his spare blanket from the foot of the bed, draping it over her. She stirred but didn't wake. As he lay back, pain still present but manageable now, Silas thought about the week to come. Eleanor's sons would arrive, wealthy men from cities, men who'd probably never spent a night in a cabin like this. They'd thank him, probably try to pay him again, and then they'd take their mother home where she belonged, and he'd go back to his silence, his solitude, his mountains. But something had shifted. The walls he'd built around himself over 8 years had developed cracks, and Eleanor Whitlock had walked right through them with her strength and her care, and her fierce disappointment in sons who'd forgotten to be sons. For the first time in years, Silas wondered what it would be like to have family again. to be part of something larger than his own survival. The thought both frightened and intrigued him. Outside, Chief nickered softly in his corral. A jay called from the pines. The mountain breathed its cold breath through the gaps in the walls. Everything was as it always was, except it wasn't, and somewhere down the mountain, 4 men were riding toward a meeting that would change all of their lives. Silas closed his eyes and let himself rest, trusting that when the time came, he'd find the strength to face whatever was coming. The brothers stayed. Eleanor had suggested they'd visit for a day or 2, then escort her home, but as one day became 3 and then a week, it became clear that something more was happening. Thomas postponed business meetings through telegrams sent from Bear Creek. James wrote to his bank explaining his absence. Robert's law partners would have to manage without him, and Daniel simply stopped making excuses. They came to the cabin each morning and asked what needed doing. At first, Silas was uncomfortable with the arrangement. Wealthy men in fine clothes trying to do work they clearly weren't trained for. But Eleanor had set the tone firmly. Her sons would help, or they would answer to her. And slowly, awkwardly, they learned. Thomas proved surprisingly capable with an axe once he stopped trying to manage the task and simply did it. Silas watched from the cabin doorway, still too weak to work, but strong enough to instruct, as the eldest Whitlock brother split firewood with grim determination. "You're muscling it," Silas called out. "Let the axe do the work." "It's about accuracy, not force." Thomas adjusted his grip and tried again. The log split clean. He looked up, surprised, and Silas nodded approval. "My father taught me to manage men," Thomas said, setting up another log. "Delegate, oversee, make the hard decisions. But he died before he could teach me much about actual work. I went from the schoolroom to the boardroom. Nothing wrong with managing," Silas said. "But a man who's never swung an axe doesn't know what he's asking of the men who do." Thomas paused, axe raised. "Is that what you think of me? That I don't understand the people who work for me?" "I think you're here learning, which says something," Silas replied. "What it says, that's up to you." Over the next hour they fell into a comfortable rhythm, Thomas working, Silas watching and occasionally commenting. The work was meditative, and gradually Thomas began to talk. About the weight of the cattle empire, about the constant pressure to expand and increase profits, about the distance that had grown between him and his wife, his children, his mother. "I thought I was building something for them," Thomas admitted, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Security, legacy, but somewhere along the way, the building became everything. I forgot who I was building it for." "Not too late to remember," Silas said. James proved better with his hands than expected. He helped Eleanor tend Silas's wounds, changing bandages with surprising gentleness. His banker's precision translated well to the careful work of cleaning and wrapping injuries. "Mother taught us basic medicine," James explained one afternoon as he worked. "She said a frontier family couldn't afford to be squeamish. But I haven't done this in 20 years. He looked at the healing wounds on Silas's torso, angry red lines that would become scars. 9 wounds. Mother said you kept fighting even after the 3rd man stabbed you. Didn't have much choice," Silas said. "Fighting's like that. You keep going until it's over." "I don't think I could have done it," James said quietly. "I've never been in a real fight. Never had to. Money insulates you from violence, lets you pay other people to handle unpleasant things." "That's not weakness," Silas said. "That's civilization. Fighting's not noble, James. It's ugly and painful, and it changes you. Your way, building banks, creating systems where people can prosper without violence, that's worth more than anything I've done." James was quiet for a long moment. "Then why do I feel like I've wasted my life accumulating things I don't need, while forgetting to be present for the people I love?" "Because you have," Silas said bluntly. "But feeling it means you can change it." Robert was the hardest to reach. He maintained his distance, watching more than participating, his lawyer's mind always analyzing. But one evening, as Silas sat outside the cabin for the first time since the fight, Robert joined him on the steps. "I've been thinking about what you said," Robert began. "About my mother's life not being a transaction. About some things not having a price. And I've built my entire career on the opposite principle. Everything has a value. Everything can be negotiated, bought, sold, or traded. Property, time, even justice. It all comes down to what someone's willing to pay. Robert stared out at the mountains. But you're right. What you did for my mother, there's no contract that covers that. No fee structure that applies. So what does that mean for you? Silas asked. Robert was quiet for a long time. It means I've been wrong about something fundamental. I've used the law to protect property, but I've forgotten about protecting people. I've represented mining companies that displaced families, railroads that seized land through legal manipulation, banks that foreclosed on people who'd lost everything. All of it legal, all of it defensible. None of it right. What will you do about it? I don't know yet, Robert admitted. But I know I can't go back to San Francisco and practice law the same way. Something has to change. I have to change. But it was Daniel who spent the most time with Silas. He'd brought his sketchbook and he drew constantly. The cabin, the mountains, Chief in his corral, his mother tending the fire. And one afternoon he asked if he could sketch Silas. Why? Silas asked, uncomfortable with the attention. Because you're real, Daniel said simply. Everyone and everything else in my life has become performance. Polite society, business obligations, maintaining appearances. But you're just, he gestured helplessly, you're just yourself. I want to capture that. So Silas sat still while Daniel sketched, and after a while Daniel began to talk. About the art school he'd attended in Paris. About the paintings he'd dreamed of creating. About the slow death of his passion as he'd let practical concerns consume him. My brothers think I'm weak, Daniel said, his charcoal moving across the paper. The dreamer who couldn't make it in the real world. So I stopped dreaming and started keeping books for a shipping company, and every day I die a little more inside. What do your brothers think now? Silas asked. Daniel looked up from his sketchbook. I don't know, but I know what Mother thinks. She gave me this. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather journal. It's hers. She kept it during the 3 days she nursed you. She wanted me to read it. He opened to a marked page and read aloud. Today I watched a man who'd given everything fight for his life with the same determination he fought for mine. He's been delirious with fever, calling out names of men who died under his command, reliving battles I can't imagine. But even in his fever he fights. He doesn't surrender. Watching him, I thought of my Daniel, who surrendered his dreams without even fighting for them. I wish I could show Daniel what real strength looks like, not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear win. Daniel's voice had gone rough. He closed the journal carefully. I'm 38 years old, and my mother had to nearly die to wake me up. What does that say about me? Says you're awake now, Silas replied. That's what matters. Over the following days, the 5 men, Silas healing, the 4 brothers learning, developed an unexpected rhythm. They shared meals around the fire outside the cabin. They worked together on small projects, repairing fence rails, splitting wood, tending to Chief and the brothers' horses. Eleanor presided over it all with quiet satisfaction, saying little but watching everything. One evening, as the sunset painted the mountains gold and red, Thomas raised a cup of coffee and a toast. To Mr. Boone, he said, for teaching us what we should have learned long ago. To family, James added, both the one we're born into and the one we choose. To living by principle, Robert said. To fighting for what matters, Daniel finished. They all drank, and Silas felt something unfamiliar and precious, belonging. He'd spent 8 years convincing himself that solitude was enough, that he didn't need human connection. But sitting here with these men and Eleanor, he understood he'd been wrong. He hadn't been healing in his isolation. He'd been hiding. Tell us about your service, Thomas said after a while. If you're willing. We'd like to understand who you were before you came to these mountains. Silas had avoided this conversation for days. But now, surrounded by people who'd earned his trust, he found himself willing to share. He told them about enlisting young, about learning to fight and track and survive. He told them about the battles, the victories and defeats, the friends lost and enemies killed. He told them about the boy with the hunting bow and why he'd finally walked away. "I thought I was done with violence," Silas said. "Thought I could leave it behind, come up here and just exist in peace. But violence found me anyway. Maybe it always does. Or maybe," he paused, thinking, "maybe the point isn't to avoid it entirely. Maybe it's about choosing when to use it and why. Your mother was worth fighting for. That makes a difference. You've given us a gift," Robert said. "Not just saving our mother, but showing us who we used to be, who we could be again." "I didn't give you anything," Silas said. "I just held up a mirror. What you do with what you see, that's your choice." Late that night, after the brothers had retired to their camp and Eleanor was asleep in his chair again, Silas lay awake thinking about mirrors and choices. For 8 years, he'd refused to look at himself, afraid of what he'd see. But these people had forced him to look, and what he saw wasn't the broken soldier he'd believed himself to be. He saw a man capable of connection, a man whose isolation had been a choice, not a destiny, a man who could still matter to someone. Outside, a wolf howled in the distance. Chief answered with a soft whinny. The fire crackled low in the hearth, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Silas felt at peace with who he was and who he'd been. The mountain was still his home, but maybe home could have room for more than just silence. By the 3rd week, Silas was strong enough to walk without assistance, though his movements were still careful and measured. The wounds had closed and were healing clean, testament to Eleanor's nursing and his own stubborn constitution. The brothers had settled into the rhythm of mountain life with surprising ease, and the cabin clearing had taken on the feeling of a small community. It was a cold evening in late November when everything changed. They'd all gathered around the fire after supper, Silas, Eleanor, and her 4 sons. The temperature had dropped sharply, promising snow before morning, and they'd pulled close to the flames for warmth. The conversation had been easy, ranging from childhood memories to plans for the future. Thomas had been talking about bringing his family to visit the ranch more often, maybe spending summers there instead of in the city. James was discussing ideas for a charitable foundation to help frontier families. Robert had grown quiet, but it was a comfortable quiet, the silence of a man thinking rather than withdrawing. And Daniel had been sketching the group around the fire, capturing the moment. "I can't remember the last time we were all together like this," Thomas said, staring into the flames. "Just sitting, talking. No agenda, no business to conduct. Christmas, 8 years ago," Eleanor said. "Before Daniel moved to St. Louis. We had dinner at the ranch house, and your father's chair sat empty, and all of you were already planning your departures." "I'm sorry, Mother," Thomas said. "For all of it. For letting the business consume me. For forgetting what matters." "I know you are," Eleanor said gently. "But sorry isn't enough. Change is what's required. Real change, lasting change. We're trying," James said. "Being here, learning from Mr. Boone, it's changing how we see things." "Is it?" Eleanor asked. "Or will you return to your old lives the moment we leave this mountain?" The question hung in the air, and Silas saw each brother grapple with it. He understood Eleanor's doubt. It was easy to make promises in the glow of firelight, harder to keep them when the world demanded your attention. "I won't go back the same," Daniel said firmly. "I can't. I've already written to the shipping company." "I'm resigning." "To do what?" Thomas asked, concern evident in his voice. "To paint," Daniel said. "Like I should have been doing all along. I have enough saved to live modestly for a year, maybe 2. If I can't make it work in that time, I'll find other work. But I have to try," Robert nodded slowly. "I've been drafting a letter to my partners, proposing we take on more pro bono cases, focus on defending people instead of just property. They may not accept the terms. I may have to leave and start my own practice. But Daniel's right. We can't go back the same." "And you, James?" Eleanor asked. "What will you do?" "I'm going to shift the bank's focus," James said. "More loans to small farmers and families, less speculation on mining ventures and railroad bonds. It'll mean lower profits, at least initially. The board may fight me. But I need to build something that actually helps people, not just enriches investors." Eleanor turned to Thomas. "And you, my eldest? You carry the weight of the family business. What will you change? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Everything, he said finally. The way we manage the ranch, the way we treat our workers, the time I spend away from home. I've been building an empire, but I've been losing my family in the process. That has to stop. I'd rather have a smaller operation and actually know my children than own half of Wyoming and be a stranger to them. Silas watched the firelight play across their faces and saw genuine resolve. These weren't empty promises born of guilt. These were men confronting the reality of their choices and deciding to choose differently. "Mr. Boone," Robert said, breaking the silence. "May I ask you something personal?" "You can ask," Silas said. "When you left the cavalry and came to these mountains, were you running from something or towards something?" Silas considered the question. "Running at first. From the killing, from the memories, from the man I'd become. But after a while I stopped running. I thought I'd found peace up here in the silence. But I realized now I was just hiding." "From what?" Daniel asked. "From living," Silas said. "From connecting with people, from mattering to anyone. I told myself I was done with all that I'd paid my dues and earned my solitude. But your mother showed me different. She showed me that isolation isn't peace. It's just another kind of death, slower, but just as final." Eleanor reached over and squeezed his hand. "And you showed my sons what real courage looks like. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to face it for something larger than yourself." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the fire crackle and the wind moving through the pines. Then Silas heard it, a sound that didn't belong. A horse, maybe two, moving through the trees above the cabin, moving carefully, trying to be quiet. He went still, his hand instinctively moving to where his knife would be if he were wearing it. The brothers noticed his change in posture, their easy conversation dying. "What is it?" Thomas asked quietly. "Someone's out there," Silas said. "In the trees, upslope, watching us." James started to rise, but Silas held up a hand. "Don't. Act natural. Could be nothing. Could be someone who got lost." But even as he said it, Silas knew it wasn't true. The way the horses were moving, start and stop, maintaining distance, spoke of surveillance, not confusion. Someone was observing them, studying them, planning something. Could it be him? Eleanor asked, her voice tight with fear she'd been holding back for weeks. "The man who escaped? Cade Brennan's brother?" "Maybe," Silas said. He'd been expecting this, truthfully. A man didn't wound 5 men and kill 2 without consequences. Marcus Brennan's reputation, as described by the sheriff, suggested he wasn't the type to let such an insult stand. "Everyone inside, now. Casual, like we're just turning in for the night." They moved with forced calm, Eleanor and her sons filing into the cabin. Silas remained by the fire a moment longer, staring up into the darkness where he'd heard the horses. He caught a brief glimpse of movement, a shadow against shadows. And then nothing. Inside the cabin the brothers were tense, hands moving unconsciously to hips where city men didn't carry weapons. "What do we do?" Thomas asked. "We wait," Silas said. "If it's Brennan, he'll make his move when he thinks he has the advantage. For now, he's just scouting, trying to figure out how many of us there are and how prepared we might be." "Should we ride for help?" James suggested. "The sheriff is 2 days away," Silas interrupted. "By the time he got here, it would be over, one way or another." "Then we need weapons," Robert said. "What do you have?" Silas took stock. His rifle, the Winchester Eleanor had carried, 2 pistols he kept in a trunk, his knife and an old cavalry saber he hadn't touched in years. Against however many men Brennan might bring, it wasn't much. "I have more guns at the ranch," Thomas said. "Good rifles." "We could send Daniel. No one's riding alone in the dark with a gang watching the cabin," Silas said firmly. He looked at Eleanor's sons, seeing fear in their eyes, but also determination. "Listen to me. If Brennan comes, and I think he will, we're going to be outnumbered. Your only advantages are these walls, the terrain, and the fact that you're going to fight like men defending their mother." "We've never fought anyone," Daniel said, his voice shaking slightly. "None of us. We're businessmen, Mr. Boone, not soldiers." "You're men," Silas corrected. "That's enough. When the time comes, you'll find out what you're made of." "We all do," Eleanor had been standing near the window, and now she turned to face them all. "My sons," she said, her voice steady despite the fear Silas knew she must be feeling. "Mr. Boone nearly died defending me from 5 men. If we're called to defend him and each other, then that's what we'll do. We're Whitlocks. We don't run." Thomas straightened, and Silas saw something shift in his face, the businessman falling away, something older and harder taking its place. "Mother's right. We stand together. Whatever comes," the others nodded one by one. And Silas felt a surge of respect for these men, who'd spent their lives in boardrooms and banks, but were willing to face violence for family. He moved to the window and looked out at the darkness. Somewhere out there, Marcus Brennan was planning his revenge. And here, in this small cabin, 6 people who'd become something like family were preparing to defend each other. The mountain had been his refuge for 8 years. Now it was about to become a battlefield. And this time, Silas wasn't alone. Morning came grey and cold, the kind of dawn that promised hardship. Silas had spent the night on watch, rotating shifts with Thomas, neither of them seeing further signs of movement, but both knowing the watchers were still out there. When Sheriff Clayton rode into the clearing just after sunrise, Silas felt relief mixed with dread. The sheriff wouldn't have made the 2-day journey unless the situation was serious. Clayton dismounted stiffly, his face grim beneath the brim of his hat. He was a man in his 60s, weathered by decades of frontier law enforcement, and the lines around his eyes spoke of hard news delivered too many times. "Boone," he said, shaking Silas's hand. "Mrs. Whitlock, gentlemen." He nodded to the brothers, who'd emerged from the cabin at the sound of his arrival. "I wish I was bringing better news, but I'm not." "It's Brennan," Silas said. "Not a question, it's Brennan," Clayton confirmed. He pulled a folded paper from his coat, a wanted poster worn from travel. The face, staring out from the rough illustration, was hard and scarred, eyes flat with the emptiness of a man who'd killed often and without remorse. Marcus Brennan, 42 years old, leader of the most dangerous gang in the territory. 20 confirmed kills, probably twice that many we can't prove. Bank robberies, stage holdups, claim jumping, murder for hire. $5,000 reward, but no one's been able to collect because he's smart and he's vicious. Eleanor took the poster, studying it. "This is the brother of the man who attacked me." "Yes, ma'am. Cade Brennan is Marcus's younger brother. Only family Marcus has, apparently. When Cade showed up wounded and humiliated, Marcus took it personal." Clayton looked at Silas. "According to my sources, Marcus left his hideout in the Absarokas 5 days ago with 18 men. They're not coming to rob you, Boone. They're coming to kill you, and anyone who stands with you." "How close are they?" Thomas asked. 3 days out, maybe less if they push hard. "They know about you boys being here, by the way. Cade must have spotted you or heard about wealthy visitors staying with the mountain man. Marcus sees opportunity. Kill Boone for revenge. Ransom the Whitlock brothers for profit. 2 birds, 1 stone. We should leave," James said immediately. "Get Mother to safety. Bring back help." "No time," Clayton interrupted. "Marcus has men watching the trails. You try to leave now, they'll ambush you in the open. Your best chance is to stay here, fort up, and make them pay for every inch. 20 men against 6? Robert said. "Those aren't good odds, Sheriff." "No, they're not. I've sent word to my deputies, but they're spread thin across 3 counties. I can't promise reinforcements." Clayton looked at each of them in turn. "I'm not going to lie to you. This is bad. But you've got some advantages. Boone knows how to fight and how to plan a defense. You've got high ground, solid cover, and time to prepare. And Marcus," he paused. "Marcus is used to easy targets. Unarmed settlers, small-town banks, travelers on the road. He's never faced men willing to stand and fight." "We're not soldiers," Daniel said, echoing his words from the night before. "No, but your men defending your mother," Clayton said. "I've seen farmers and shopkeepers do remarkable things when they're protecting what matters. You might surprise yourself." After Clayton left, riding out to spread word and round up whatever help he could find, the 6 of them stood in the clearing, facing the reality of what was coming. The silence stretched until Eleanor broke it. "I will not be the reason my sons die," she said firmly. "I can ride." Give me a horse and provisions, and I'll draw them away. They want me. Let them chase me. No, Thomas said, and his voice carried authority Silas hadn't heard before. You're not bait, Mother. You're not sacrificing yourself. We're staying together. Thomas is right, Silas said. Splitting up gives Brennan exactly what he wants, targets he can pick off one at a time. Together we have a chance. A slim chance, Robert pointed out. Better than none, Silas countered. He looked at the cabin, the surrounding terrain, the tree line. His mind was already working the way it used to, seeing angles and approaches, calculating fields of fire and defensive positions. The cavalry officer he'd thought was dead was stirring to life. If we're going to survive this, we need to turn this clearing into a fortress. We've got 3 days. Let's use them. What followed was the most intensive 3 days of the Whitlock brothers' lives. Under Silas's direction, they transformed the peaceful mountain homestead into a defensive position. They cut trees and dragged them into barriers. They dug rifle pits at strategic points around the clearing. They stockpiled ammunition, water, and food in the cabin. They identified escape routes and fallback positions. Thomas proved to have a mind for strategy, understanding terrain and tactics quickly once Silas explained the principles. James's banking precision translated to careful inventory and resource management. Robert's legal mind helped plan contingencies and backup plans. And Daniel's artist's eye caught details others missed: sightlines, blind spots, angles of approach. Eleanor refused to be sidelined. She inventoried medical supplies, prepared bandages, and set up a makeshift infirmary in the corner of the cabin. "I've nursed 1 wounded man," she said. "I can nurse more if needed." On the second day, Silas gathered them around his old cavalry maps, detailed topographical charts he'd kept from his service days. He spread them on the table, weighting the corners with stones. "Here's how they'll come," he said, tracing routes with his finger. "Main trail from the south, that's the obvious approach, so they'll probably feint there but hit us from the east where the tree cover's better. They'll try to pin us down, maybe use fire to smoke us out. If that fails, they'll wait for dark and try to overrun us." "How do you know all this?" Daniel asked. "Because it's what I'd do," Silas said. "Marcus isn't stupid. He's survived this long by being careful. He'll probe our defenses, test our resolve, look for weaknesses. Our job is to make the cost so high he decides it's not worth it. And if he doesn't?" James asked. Silas met his eyes. "Then we make sure we take as many of them with us as we can. Sometimes survival isn't about winning, it's about making the enemy regret fighting you at all." That evening, they took inventory of weapons: Silas's rifle and pistols, Eleanor's Winchester. Thomas had brought a hunting rifle from his saddle. James had a small pistol he'd carried for protection on his banking travels. Robert and Daniel were unarmed. "Not enough," Thomas said, staring at the small arsenal. "Then we make do," Silas replied. He pulled his old saber from its place in the corner. "This belonged to my commanding officer. He gave it to me when he retired. I've never used it in combat, always preferred the knife. But it'll serve." He handed it to Robert, who took it with obvious uncertainty. "I don't know how to use a sword." "Blade goes in the other man," Silas said. "You'll figure out the rest when you have to." On the third day, Silas taught them to shoot properly. Not the casual target practice they'd done as boys, but real combat shooting, firing from cover, conserving ammunition, making every shot count. Thomas was the best natural shot. James was steady under pressure. Robert proved surprisingly accurate once he stopped overthinking. And Daniel, despite his trembling hands, managed to hit 3 out of 5 targets. "Fear's normal," Silas told him. "Don't fight it, use it. Fear keeps you alert, makes you careful. It's panic that kills you." That night they wrote letters. Silas had suggested it, knowing from experience that men facing death needed to say goodbye to loved ones, just in case. Thomas wrote to his wife and children, James to his parents and siblings, Robert to colleagues and friends, Daniel to fellow artists whose opinions he valued. Eleanor wrote a single letter, addressed to her 4 sons, to be opened only if she didn't survive. Silas wrote nothing. He had no one to write to, no family waiting, no legacy to leave. 8 years of isolation had ensured that. But as he watched the Whitlock family pen their final words, he felt the weight of what he'd given up by choosing solitude. Late that night, Unable to sleep, Silas walked the perimeter one last time. The moon was bright, turning the clearing silver, and he could see the barriers they'd built, the rifle pits they'd dug, the preparations they'd made. It looked like a military encampment, which is exactly what it had become. Thomas found him there, standing near the southern approach. "Can we win this?" Thomas asked. Silas considered lying, offering false hope. But Thomas deserved truth. "I don't know. 20 against 6 are long odds. But we've got preparation, position, and purpose. That counts for something." "Purpose," Thomas repeated. "Defending Mother." "Defending each other. That's right. Brennan's men are mercenaries. They're fighting for a paycheck and fear of their boss. You're fighting for something irreplaceable. That gives you an edge they don't have." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I never thanked you properly. For what you did for Mother. For what you've done for us, teaching us, preparing us, giving us a chance." "Nothing to thank," Silas said. "You're good men. You just forgot it for a while." "If I die tomorrow," Thomas said, "I want you to know these 3 weeks have mattered more than the last 10 years of my life. You gave me back my family. You gave me back myself." Silas clasped his shoulder. "You did that yourself." "I just held up the mirror." They stood together in the moonlight, two men from different worlds who'd found common ground in the crucible of coming violence. And in that moment, Silas understood that whatever happened tomorrow, he'd already won something precious. He'd found family again. He mattered to someone. The mountain was still his home. But now it held people worth defending. As they walked back to the cabin, Silas saw Eleanor watching from the window. When their eyes met, she nodded once. Gratitude, trust, and fierce determination. He'd saved her life once. Tomorrow, they'd save each other's or die trying. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of snow and pine. Somewhere to the south, Marcus Brennan's gang was making camp, preparing for their assault. And here, in this small clearing high in the Wyoming Rockies, 6 people were preparing to teach them that some things, honor, family, and character, were worth more than survival itself. Dawn of the 4th day broke cold and clear. Silas woke before first light, as he always did, but this time his first thought wasn't of coffee or chores. It was of the gang that would arrive today, and the violence that would come with them. He rose quietly, mindful of the others sleeping in the cabin, Eleanor in his bed, the brothers on bedrolls spread across the floor. They looked peaceful in sleep, innocent of what the day would bring. For a moment, Silas considered how different this cabin felt now compared to 3 weeks ago. Then it had been empty except for him. Now it was full of life, warmth, purpose. Worth defending? He slipped outside and walked the perimeter, checking their preparations one final time. The barriers they'd built looked solid in the pre-dawn light. The rifle pits were positioned well, offering good cover and overlapping fields of fire. The cabin itself was stocked with enough supplies to withstand a siege if necessary. They'd done everything possible to prepare, but Silas had seen enough battles to know that preparation only went so far. When the shooting started, chaos took over. Men forgot their training, made mistakes, panicked. The difference between life and death often came down to luck and split-second decisions. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to find Thomas approaching, 2 cups of coffee in hand. The eldest Whitlock brother offered one to Silas, and they stood together, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. "Couldn't sleep," Thomas said. "Normal before a fight," Silas replied. "Body knows what's coming." "I keep thinking about my children," Thomas admitted. "Margaret is 7, Arthur is 5, and little Eleanor, named after Mother, just turned 2. If I don't come home, your wife will raise them knowing their father died protecting their grandmother." Silas interrupted gently. "That's a legacy worth leaving. But we're not planning to die today, Thomas. We're planning to survive by killing other men," Thomas said, and there was struggle in his voice. "I've never killed anyone, never even thought I would. Now I'm preparing to do it to protect my family. That's the difference between you and them," Silas said. "They're coming to kill for pride and profit. You're defending what matters. There's no shame in that. No guilt in protecting the people you love." Thomas nodded slowly, sipping his coffee. "How do you live with it? The killing you've done?" It was the question Silas had been asking himself for decades. Some of it I regret. The boy with the bow, I'll carry that until I die. But the men I killed defending your mother? No regret at all. They made their choice. I made mine. Sometimes the world forces you to choose between bad options. You pick the least bad one and live with it. By the time the others woke, Silas had finalized his battle plan. He gathered them around the table, spreading out his hand-drawn map of the clearing. They'll come before noon, he said. Marcus will want daylight for the first assault. Time to adjust if we're stronger than expected. Here's how we position ourselves. He assigned each person a station. Thomas would take the southern rifle pit, covering the main approach. James would hold the eastern position, watching the tree line there. Robert would man the western barrier. Daniel would stay with Eleanor in the cabin, providing backup and tending any wounded. And Silas himself would remain mobile, moving between positions as needed. Remember what I taught you, Silas continued. Don't waste ammunition. Make them expose themselves to get a shot. If they charge, fall back to the next position. We've prepared 3 defensive lines. And most importantly, he looked at each of them. Don't freeze. When you see a man with a gun pointed at someone you love, you pull your trigger. Hesitation gets people killed. Eleanor spoke up from where she sat near the fireplace. And if they breach the cabin? Silas met her eyes. Then we fight with whatever we have, but it won't come to that. They'll break before we do. He said it with conviction, but privately Silas wasn't certain. 20 men was a substantial force. Even with preparation and position, the numbers were heavily against them. But doubt served no purpose now. Confidence, real or projected, could make the difference. They spent the morning in final preparations. Thomas and James moved extra ammunition to their positions. Robert double-checked the barriers, reinforcing weak points. Daniel helped Eleanor organize the medical supplies. And Silas walked the perimeter one last time, his cavalry training taking over, seeing the battlefield not as his home, but as terrain to be defended. Around mid-morning, Chief began to whinny nervously in his corral. The brothers' horses picked up the agitation, stamping and tossing their heads. Animals sensed danger before humans did. They're here, Silas said quietly. Everyone to positions. The brothers moved with surprising calm, each man taking his assigned place. Eleanor and Daniel retreated into the cabin, Eleanor's Winchester loaded and ready. Silas climbed to the cabin roof. They'd built a simple firing platform there and scanned the tree line with his spyglass. Movement. Multiple figures spread out through the pines to the south. He counted 7, 8, 9 men visible. The rest would be flanking, trying to encircle the clearing. Marcus was being careful, smart. He knew about the brothers, knew this wouldn't be as simple as killing one old mountain man. I see 9 to the south, Silas called down. Assume at least that many coming around the sides. Remember your sectors. Don't let them draw you out of position. The waiting was the hardest part. Silas watched the gang spread out, taking their time, assessing the defenses. A tall man with a scarred face, Marcus Brennan, unmistakable even at a distance, stood near the tree line, studying the clearing through his own spyglass. Silas met his gaze across 200 yards, 2 men who understood violence evaluating each other. Then Marcus lowered his spyglass and gestured. 3 men broke from cover, moving toward the clearing at a run. Silas sighted his rifle, exhaled slowly, and fired. The lead runner spun and fell. Thomas fired from his position, and a second man went down. The third made it to cover behind a boulder, but the message was sent. Approaching the cabin would cost blood. Good shooting, Silas called to Thomas. But conserve your ammunition. We've got a long day ahead. Marcus's response came swift and brutal. 15 men opened fire simultaneously, a wall of lead that tore into the barriers and kicked up dirt around the defensive positions. The brothers ducked low, and Silas pressed flat against the cabin roof. The initial volley was meant to intimidate, to make them waste ammunition firing back blindly. Silas waited for the firing to slack, then picked his targets carefully. A man exposing himself to reload, another shifting position. 2 shots, 2 hits, though he couldn't tell if they were kills or wounds. What mattered was making them cautious, making them understand that every advance would be paid for in blood. The pattern repeated through the morning. Marcus would send men forward, testing different approaches. The defenders would exact a cost. The gang would fall back, regroup, and try again. By noon, 3 of Brennan's men were definitely dead, several more wounded, and the gang had gained exactly 0 ground. Silas allowed himself a moment of hope. Maybe they could hold. Maybe the cost would be too high, and Marcus would decide revenge wasn't worth it. Then the gang brought up fire arrows. "Water!" Silas shouted. "They're going to try to burn us out." Daniel and Eleanor emerged from the cabin with buckets, ready to douse any flames. But Marcus was smarter than Silas had given him credit for. The fire arrows weren't aimed at the cabin. They were aimed at the barriers, the wooden defenses they'd built. Within minutes, their carefully constructed fortifications were burning. "Fall back to second line," Silas ordered. The brothers retreated from their positions as flames consumed the outer defenses. This was the moment Marcus had been waiting for. As the defenders moved, exposed during their withdrawal, the gang charged. 20 men screaming, firing, rushing across the clearing toward positions that were suddenly vulnerable. Silas fired, worked the bolt, fired again. Beside him, Thomas was shooting with grim determination. James's pistol cracked from the eastern position. Robert's rifle spoke from the west, but they were being overwhelmed. A bullet struck the cabin wall beside Silas's head, showering him with splinters. Another round punched through his coat sleeve, close enough to feel the heat. Below, he saw James take a hit in the shoulder, spinning him around. Daniel rushed out to drag his brother to safety, and a bullet meant for Daniel hit the doorframe instead. "Robert, cover the cabin door!" Silas shouted. He dropped from the roof, too old to land gracefully, but adrenaline made him ignore the pain in his still-healing wounds and ran to where James had fallen. Together with Daniel, he got the wounded man inside, Eleanor already moving to treat him. "It's not bad," James gasped, his face pale. "Went through clean, missed the bone." "You're done fighting," Eleanor said firmly, pressing bandages against the wound. "Daniel, you're taking his position." Daniel picked up his brother's pistol with shaking hands and moved to the window. Silas saw the fear in the young man's eyes, but also determination. The artist who'd spent his life avoiding conflict was about to step into it. Outside, the gang had taken the outer positions and was consolidating, preparing for a final push. Silas counted 13 men still standing. They'd killed or wounded 7, a significant toll, but not enough. Marcus would throw everything at them now, overwhelming force against their last defenses. Silas checked his ammunition. 5 rounds left in his rifle, 6 in his pistol. Not nearly enough. He looked at Thomas, saw the same grim calculation on his face. They'd made the gang pay, but it wasn't enough. "Listen to me," Silas said, gathering them all. "They're coming for the cabin. We hold them at the doorway, make them funnel through. Eleanor, you and James stay in the back room. The rest of us form a line. They get through that door. They have to go through us first." "This is my fault," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "All of you dying for me? We're dying for each other," Thomas interrupted. "For family. For what matters." "That's not your fault, Mother. That's our choice." Robert and Daniel nodded. And Silas felt fierce pride in these men who'd been soft 3 weeks ago, but had found steel in themselves when it mattered. "Then let's make it count," Silas said. He picked up his knife, the blade that had taken 9 wounds for Eleanor, and hefted it. "They want this cabin. They'll pay for every inch." Outside, Marcus Brennan shouted orders. The final assault was coming. Inside, 6 people prepared to show 20 killers what family meant. The assault came like a thunderstorm, sudden, overwhelming, violent. 13 men rushed the cabin from 3 sides simultaneously, their war cries merging into a wall of sound meant to terrify. Silas had heard such cries before, on battlefields from Kansas to Montana, and they'd stopped frightening him decades ago. But he saw Thomas flinch, saw Daniel's hands shake on his rifle, and understood that for them, this was the first time they'd faced death running at them with guns blazing. "Hold steady," Silas called, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Pick your targets, fire!" Thomas's rifle cracked, and a man 20 yards out stumbled and fell. Robert fired next, his shot striking a charging outlaw in the leg. The man went down screaming, and the others had to leap over him, their advance momentarily disrupted. Daniel squeezed his trigger, missed, but the shot was close enough to make two men dive for cover, but there were too many of them. They hit the cabin's outer perimeter, the last ring of barricades, and started tearing through, using axes and brute strength to break down what had taken days to build. Bullets punched through the cabin walls, filling the air with splinters and dust. A round shattered the window beside Robert, showering him with glass. He kept firing, blood running down his face from a dozen small cuts. "Daniel, reload," Silas ordered, seeing the young man frozen, staring at the charging men. "Daniel." The sharp command broke through Daniel's shock. He ducked below the window, his fingers fumbling with cartridges. Silas moved to cover his position, firing through the broken window. 2 shots left in his rifle. He made them count. One man dropped clutching his chest, another spun away, holding his arm. Then his rifle was empty. He drew his pistol as the first outlaw reached the cabin door. The man was young, maybe 25, with wild eyes and a revolver in each hand. He kicked the door. It held, the bar Silas had installed doing its job, and fired through the wood. The bullets thudded into the interior wall, dangerously close to where Eleanor was tending James. Silas fired through the door, 3 shots in rapid succession. He heard a cry and a thud as a body fell outside. But the door wouldn't hold long. Already he could hear them gathering, preparing to rush it en masse. "Thomas, Robert, Daniel, with me," Silas commanded. "Form a line behind the door. When it breaks, we hit them before they can spread out." The 3 brothers moved to flank him, and Silas saw something remarkable in their faces. The fear was still there, but it was controlled now, channeled into something harder. Thomas held his rifle like a club, ready to swing. Robert gripped the cavalry saber with white knuckles. Daniel had picked up Silas's hunting knife, the blade that had saved their mother, and held it low and ready. "Whatever happens," Thomas said quietly. "It's been an honor." "Honor's what got us here," Silas replied. "Now let's finish it." The door exploded inward, torn from its hinges by multiple bodies hitting it simultaneously. 3 men tumbled through the opening, tangled together, and Silas was on them before they could recover. His knife found the first man's throat. Thomas brought his rifle butt down on the second man's head with a crack that spoke of skull meeting wood. Robert thrust with the saber, clumsy but effective, and the third man fell back, blood spreading across his shirt. But more were coming. Through the shattered doorway, Silas could see Marcus Brennan himself, pushing his men forward with shouts and threats. The gang leader's face was twisted with rage. This was taking too long, costing too much, making him look weak in front of his own men. A bullet took Robert in the side, spinning him around. He fell against the wall, the saber clattering from his hands. Daniel screamed his brother's name and lunged forward, driving the knife into the shooter's belly with desperate strength. The man's eyes went wide with surprise, and Daniel pulled the blade free with a sob. "I'm fine," Robert gasped, clutching his side. Blood seeped between his fingers. Still breathing. "Keep fighting." Thomas was wrestling with an outlaw who'd gotten through the door, the 2 men locked together, struggling for control of a pistol between them. Silas moved to help, but another attacker was on him, a massive man with a scarred face and fists like hammers. Not Marcus, but one of his lieutenants, someone who'd killed before and knew how to do it efficiently. The big man's first punch caught Silas in the ribs, where his wounds were still healing. Pain exploded through his torso, white-hot and devastating. His vision darkened at the edges. The second punch missed as Silas twisted away, but the third caught him in the jaw, snapping his head back. He was going down. He knew it. His body, pushed beyond its limits, was giving out. The big man raised his boot to stomp on Silas's throat, and Silas thought, "This is it. This is how it ends." Then Eleanor Whitlock stepped out of the back room, her Winchester rifle at her shoulder, and fired. The big man's head snapped back and he collapsed like a felled tree, landing half on top of Silas. Eleanor worked the lever action, chambered another round, and fired at a man coming through the door. "He went down." She fired again. And again. "You will not," she said, her voice steady and cold, "touch my family." Outside, someone shouted, not a war cry, but a warning. The shooting changed rhythm, becoming more scattered, defensive rather than aggressive. Through the ringing in his ears, Silas heard something that made his heart leap, a bugle call. Cavalry charge. Sheriff Clayton had found help after all. The sound of horses thundering up the mountain trail was the most beautiful thing Silas had ever heard. He pushed himself up from under the dead outlaw's weight, ignoring the screaming pain in his ribs, and staggered to the doorway. What he saw made him understand why the gang's assault had faltered. 20 horsemen in cavalry uniforms were sweeping up the trail. Not active military, but a territorial militia unit that Sheriff Clayton must have summoned. They were older men, veterans like himself, riding with the practiced precision of soldiers who'd never quite left the service behind. And at their head rode Clayton himself, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun, a Winchester rifle in his hands. Marcus Brennan saw them too, and Silas watched the calculation play across the gang leader's scarred face. He'd already lost half his men to a defense he'd thought would crumble. Now he faced fresh fighters with military training. The mathematics of survival were simple and brutal. "Fall back!" Marcus roared to his remaining men. "Into the trees, now!" The gang scattered, some running for their horses, others simply fleeing on foot into the forest. But the militia had anticipated this, splitting into 2 groups to cut off escape routes. Gunfire erupted across the clearing as outlaws and lawmen exchanged fire. Marcus himself was running for a horse tied to a tree at the clearing's edge. Silas saw him mount, saw him wheel the animal around, and in that moment their eyes met across the chaos. There was no honor in Marcus's gaze, no respect, just cold rage and a promise that this wasn't over. Then Marcus kicked his horse into a gallop and disappeared into the trees, 3 of his men following. The militia gave chase, but the dense forest and the gang's desperation gave them an edge. Within minutes, the sounds of pursuit faded into the distance. The clearing fell silent, except for the moans of wounded men and the nervous stamping of horses. Silas leaned against the doorframe, suddenly aware of how much his body hurt. His ribs felt like they were on fire. His jaw was swelling where the big man had punched him. His old wounds had reopened in places, blood seeping through his shirt, but they were alive. Somehow, impossibly, they were alive. Sheriff Clayton dismounted and walked toward the cabin, his face grim as he took in the scene. 8 dead outlaws lay scattered around the clearing. Another 5 were wounded, being gathered by militia members. Thomas, Robert, and Daniel stood in the doorway, covered in blood and gunpowder residue, their fine clothes torn and filthy. Eleanor remained inside, still holding her rifle, still ready to fight if needed. "Jesus, Boone," Clayton said. "When you make a stand, you don't do it halfway." "They didn't leave us much choice," Silas replied. He glanced at the brothers. These men held, fought like veterans. Clayton looked at Thomas, James, Robert, and Daniel with new respect. "I heard you were businessmen, soft city types." "Looks like I heard wrong. We were," Thomas said quietly. His hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. "We're not anymore." Inside the cabin, Eleanor was tending to James and Robert, both wounded but stable. James's shoulder was bandaged tight, the bleeding stopped. Robert's side wound had been cleaned and wrapped. Both men were pale but conscious, sitting against the wall with the exhausted relief of men who'd expected to die but hadn't. "Mother," Thomas said, kneeling beside Eleanor. "Are you hurt?" "Not a scratch," she said, though her hands trembled as she worked. "But James needs a doctor. Robert too. And Mr. Boone." She looked at Silas with concern. "You're bleeding again." "I'll live," Silas said. He'd survived worse, but he let her guide him to a chair, let her cut away his shirt to examine the reopened wounds. Her touch was gentle, but her eyes were fierce. "You old fool," she said softly. "You should have stayed down. Let us handle it, and miss you saving us all." Silas managed to smile despite the pain. "You were magnificent, Eleanor. Your husband would have been proud." She blinked back tears. "Arthur always said I was too stubborn to die gracefully. I suppose he was right." Sheriff Clayton entered, followed by the militia captain, a grey-bearded man named Peters, who Silas vaguely remembered from his cavalry days. "Boone," Peters said, offering his hand. Long time. Heard you'd gone mountain man. Didn't expect to find you defending a position like this. Didn't expect to have to, Silas replied, shaking the offered hand. But I'm grateful for the timing. Another 5 minutes and you'd have found a way, Peters interrupted. You always did. That's why they called you Phantom. He looked at the brothers. Your young friends here fought well. Took real courage to stand against those odds. They had something worth fighting for, Silas said. That makes all the difference. Peters nodded. Then his expression grew serious. Marcus Brennan got away. 4 of his men with him. They're wounded, on foot now. We got their horses, but they're still dangerous. Let them go, Silas said. They're broken. Word will spread that they hit a defended position and got torn apart. Marcus's reputation is finished. He won't be back. Maybe, Peters said doubtfully. But I'd watch your back all the same. As the militia helped move the wounded and collect the dead, Thomas came to stand beside Silas. The eldest Whitlock brother's face was haggard, aged years in a single day. There was blood on his hands, some his own, some not, and his eyes held the haunted look of a man who'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. I killed a man, Thomas said quietly. 2, actually. I can still see their faces. You'll always see them, Silas said. That's the cost. But you killed them defending your family. Remember that when the faces come back at night, you didn't have a choice. I had a choice, Thomas said. I could have run. Could have left you to fight alone. Could have taken Mother and fled. But you didn't, Silas said. You stood. That's what makes you a man worth knowing. Daniel approached, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. I stabbed someone. Felt his blood on my hands. I don't know if I can. You can, Eleanor said firmly, joining them. She put her arms around Daniel, then Thomas, then pulled Robert and the wounded James into the embrace. You all can, because you did what was necessary, because you protected each other, because that's what family does. They stood together in the ruined cabin, 5 people bound by blood and 1 bound by choice, all of them changed forever by violence, but not broken by it. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the mountains red and gold. The day that had started with death was ending with survival, and for Silas Boone, who'd spent 8 years believing he was done with both violence and connection, it was ending with the understanding that some things, family, loyalty, love, were worth any cost. 3 weeks after the battle, the cabin stood repaired and peaceful once more. The militia and sheriff had left after 2 days, taking the wounded outlaws to face justice and burying the dead in a clearing down the mountain. The Whitlock brothers had stayed, helping Silas rebuild what the fight had destroyed. Together, they'd replaced the shattered door, patched bullet holes in the walls, and constructed new barriers, though these were lower, less militant, more symbolic than defensive. Silas stood on his porch in the early morning light, a cup of coffee warming his hands, and watched his breath plume in the cold air. Snow had fallen during the night, the first real accumulation of winter, and it turned the mountain landscape into something clean and new. Behind him, he could hear Eleanor moving around the cabin, making breakfast for everyone. The brothers were still asleep in their camp, but they'd be up soon, drawn by the smell of bacon and coffee. It was time for them to leave. They all knew it. James and Robert needed proper medical care for their wounds. Thomas had a business to run and a family to return to. Daniel had plans forming, a new life to begin. And Eleanor, though she'd been content here, belonged with her sons, making sure they kept the promises they'd made. But Silas found himself reluctant to see them go. The cabin that had felt too small 3 weeks ago now felt like it would be too large once they left. He'd grown accustomed to voices, to conversation, to Eleanor's quiet presence and the brothers' questions and laughter. Silence, once his greatest comfort, now seemed like it might be a burden. Thomas emerged from the camp first, walking through the snow to join Silas on the porch. His shoulder was still wrapped where a bullet had grazed him, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone still healing. But there was something different in his bearing now, a groundedness that hadn't been there before. "Mother says we should leave tomorrow," Thomas said, accepting the cup of coffee Eleanor brought out to him. Get James and Robert to a doctor. Start putting our lives back in order. Probably wise, Silas agreed, though the words felt hollow. I wanted to thank you again, Thomas continued, not just for saving Mother or teaching us to defend ourselves, for showing us who we'd become, who we could be again. You did that yourselves, Silas said. I just held up the mirror, Thomas finished, smiling. Yes, I remember. But you held it steady when we wanted to look away. That matters. The others emerged gradually, Robert moving stiffly, his side wound still healing, James with his arm in a sling, Daniel carrying his sketchbook as always. Eleanor brought out more coffee and breakfast, and they all gathered on the porch despite the cold, as if none of them wanted to retreat inside where the coming goodbye would feel more final. I've made some decisions, Thomas said once everyone was settled. About the business, about my life, I'm selling half of the cattle operation to my partners. I'll stay on as manager, but I'm scaling back, spending more time with my family, less time chasing expansion. The bank board wasn't thrilled with my new direction, James added. So I resigned. I'm starting my own lending institution, focused on helping families rather than maximizing returns. It'll be smaller, less profitable, but more honest. Robert had been quiet, but now he spoke up. I've dissolved my partnership in San Francisco. I'm opening a practice here in the territory, defending settlers' rights, fighting land grabs, doing the kind of law that actually helps people. It won't make me rich, but I think it'll let me sleep at night. Daniel smiled, and it was the first genuine happiness Silas had seen in his face since the battle. I'm painting again. Really painting. I've rented a small studio in Denver. I don't know if I'll make any money, but Mother's right. I was meant to be an artist, not a bookkeeper. Time I started living like I believed it. Eleanor looked at her sons with fierce pride. I'm returning to the ranch, she said. But not as a visitor. Thomas needs help managing the operation, and I've discovered I'm not ready to retire to a rocking chair just yet. Besides, she glanced at Silas, I've been reminded that life is meant to be lived, not observed from a safe distance. They talked through the morning about plans and futures, about lessons learned and changes made. But beneath it all was the unspoken question that finally James voiced. What about you, Mr. Boone? You've changed our lives. What changes for you? Silas had been thinking about that question for days. The easy answer would be to say nothing, that he'd return to his solitary life, his quiet existence on the mountain. But he knew that was a lie. Everything had changed. He'd changed. I'm staying here, he said slowly. This is my home, but I'm not hiding anymore. I'll come down to Bear Creek more often. Maybe visit the ranch sometimes if the invitation stands. It stands, Eleanor said firmly. Always. And I'm thinking about taking on some work, Silas continued. Sheriff Clayton mentioned they need deputies. Men who know the territory, who can handle themselves. I spent 8 years running from what I was. Maybe it's time I use those skills for something good again. Thomas stood and offered his hand. Then we'll see you again. Often I hope. Silas shook his hand, then each brother's in turn. These men who'd been strangers a month ago now felt like family. Brothers in a way that went deeper than blood, bonded by shared danger, mutual respect, and the transformation they'd undergone together. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Daniel presented Silas with a gift. It was a painting, the 5 of them standing together outside the cabin, captured in the days before the battle. Eleanor in her blue dress, dignified and strong. Thomas, James, Robert and Daniel in their fine clothes, looking uncertain but determined. And Silas himself, weathered and scarred, but somehow more present than he'd been in years. I wanted you to remember, Daniel said. Not the violence, but this. The family we became. Silas hung the painting where the photograph had been, on the wall beside his bed. That night, after everyone had retired, he sat alone by the fire and studied it. The man in that painting wasn't the same one who'd woken in this cabin 2 months ago. That man had been hiding from life, from connection, from meaning. This man, the one he was becoming, was ready to engage again. To be part of the world, to matter to people, to use what he'd learned for something larger than survival. When morning came, he helped them pack. Eleanor embraced him, holding on longer than necessary. "You saved more than my life," she whispered. "You saved my son's souls. And I think maybe they saved yours too." "Maybe they did," Silas agreed. He watched them ride down the mountain trail, 5 people on horses, Eleanor looking back once to wave. He waved back, and it didn't feel like goodbye. It felt like "see you soon." The cabin was quiet when he went back inside. But it was a different kind of quiet now, peaceful rather than empty, restful rather than isolating. His life would go on here, in these mountains he loved. But it would go on connected to other lives, meaningful to people who mattered. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood on his porch, looking out over the valley. Somewhere down there, Sheriff Clayton was waiting for his answer about the deputy position. Somewhere further still, the Whitlock family was beginning their new lives, lives he'd helped shape. And here, on this mountain, Silas Boone was beginning his own new life. Not running anymore, not hiding, just living, with all the connection and meaning and risk that implied. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.